Inclusion podcast by the Centre for Inclusive Leadership. Hello, welcome along to our Inclusion podcast. And this month we're going to be talking about religion and spirituality in the workplace. And I'm just delighted to tell you that I'm joined by my colleague and my friend, AndreRadmall. Andre, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. Yeah, good to be here.
How are you feeling about us throwing you into this conversation for your very first visit to the studio?
Nice, light topic.
Yeah, just somewhere light. I think a good subject for us to get into, though, but maybe it would be helpful for our audience to give a little bit of background, a little context about how you come into us, because obviously you're one of our primary storytellers and you come with a really interesting background, which is why I was very keen to have this conversation with you, because you have a spiritual background for sure, and you and I both have kind of tracked with each other in kind of pastoral life as well, which has been quite interesting. In fact, that's where we first met, wasn't it? I think that was our very first connection, gosh. So, but we're rather, how should I say, re-traditionalized folks, I suspect, in terms of the reconstructed world in which we both live in. But Andre, you've been doing some brilliant work working with the team in terms of the delivery and helping us develop our storylines and helping us with our creative content, and clients have loved you. But you bring a therapeutic lens to it. Perhaps you can just tell us a little bit about yourself and actually what might bring you into a conversation about religion and spirituality before we jump into the thrust of our conversation.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. I have these intersecting stories, narratives that I've had in my life, most of my life actually, in some shape or form. One is storytelling and understanding the world through the lens of story. And the other is spirituality, and sometimes that's kind of taken a more religious form and sometimes maybe not. I can say a bit more about that.
Yeah, please.
But I can remember when I was about 6, sitting in a wigwam in my garden in Epsom and praying to a god. I have no idea what this meant, but I just had some vague concept of something up there, something that I could get some help from, perhaps.
How interesting.
And so I don't even know where I get these things from, because my family didn't really go to church, they weren't particularly religious, but I'd heard about God from somewhere and I'd heard something about praying. So my early start was about dialoguing with this entity, and that's pretty much the way I think about storytelling as well, which is that it's a dialogue.
Dialoguing, really nice.
It's a kind of conversation in which people find out more about themselves and the world. And as I grew up and I read things like C.S. Lewis and all the Narnia stories, I kind of got really taken up with the power of storytelling. And I think when I grew up into being a professional, I was working as a therapist for a lot of my career, which again I think is working with stories. How do people make sense of themselves and the world, and what stories perhaps are not being told that can be surfaced and released? So for me, storytelling and this whole conversation about spirituality and religion are very intersected.
Very, very interesting. And of course, the lovely thing about that whole storytelling piece, particularly when you think from a therapeutic point of view, is I think there's some interesting work to do. But I think we see it at one level in the corporate space as well, where you're having to sort of almost like this narrative therapy, which part of that is reauthoring story, isn't it, to actually clean it up. And I do think to myself that this conversation about religion and spirituality, one of the things that I would say with my interest in it is that I've had to reauthor that story, because whereas you sat in a wigwam in Epsom as a 6-year-old child, I remember being in Paddy's wigwam, as they call it, in Liverpool, in the big Catholic cathedral, thinking to myself, this is a fantastic building, but I'm not entirely sure all these dots quite join up for me. And then I've been to various other wigwams since then, I can tell you. But there is a saying, right, that in polite company, we must never talk about two things. You're not allowed to talk about religion, and you're not allowed to talk about politics. And I can understand that, but when we think about religion in the workplace, and we do a lot of work, as you know, when we're looking at managing people's inclusion and thinking about the lived experience and how you see sometimes people understand their lived experience through the lens of their religion. It's a very interesting and tricky space. But why do you think that this notion of not talking about, we'll put politics for the side for a moment, not talking about religion is a here's some good advice, don't do that. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's to do with a real desire and a basic instinct, actually, to not upset other people. And I think for some reason, religion is one of those things that sometimes can be felt to be a risky thing to talk about, because it's one of those things that people can get oppositional about. So either you're in or you're out in some kind of narratives about religion.
So there's consequences, right? If you're in or you're out. Sorry, I've interrupted you.
I think one of the problems can be that people have assumptions about what a religion means, and those assumptions don't match up with the individual's experience and the lived story that they're actually having. So I come from broadly speaking, a Christian background, and so if I was to say I'm a Christian, and I actually then went on to train for ministry in the church and ended up being ordained as a minister in the Church of England, that's a narrative that I don't always bring into the conversation, actually, because it can feel like people are going to have some assumptions about that and what sort of person I am, what I might believe. And so in order to fit in, going back to the fitting in idea,
of course.
what happens, I think, is sometimes people edit out some of this aspect of their lives, which is, I think, somewhat problematic, because this is actually to do with identity, and it's to do with cultural kind of roots that people might have in terms of family and the people that people live with outside of work. So I think that's quite a problem if that gets edited out, because people are more focused on fitting in and not causing any turbulence.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think this is a fascinating route that you're taking, because it seems to me that there may be a kind of double bind on this particular point, because I think that this notion of what I would describe as the stigma. So if I think to myself, and like you, if I describe myself and if I describe myself and I say, oh, I'm a Christian, I then feel this pressing need to then justify what I'm not by having said that, right? So I go, oh yes, I'm a Christian, and then the very next thing that I will do is go, but I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And then then I'll rush in with a whole load of other freighted stuff that I want to bring in to go, and I'm not like this and I'm not like that. And I've been wondering about that recently, because I've been thinking to myself, actually at quite a deep level, the notion of saying, well, Paul, let's just think this through for a second, because is it that you're projecting your stereotype of what a Christian is on this environment, or is it that that's being projected back at you, or is it a combustible collision of the two? And I think in many respects it's probably both.
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation with somebody not that long ago about my sort of media profile, because I sometimes go on radio shows.
Yeah, sure, I've heard you lots of times. You
do these things, and I never included being a priest in my media profile.
Oh, interesting.
And they were saying, and this was just like in terms of presenting a show, mainstream media show, that it's an asset, not a deficit.
But you see, that's interesting, because when you whatever social identities that we have, and being a person of faith, I mean, I'm even now trying to clean it up. That social identity is an asset. It's not a problem, right? But I think that there are words that feel so damaged that what I end up doing, and I think I want to come back and press you a bit harder on what the anxiety is. But I think some of these words are so damaged that you just can't use them in. Well, for me, it works like this. My concern is that if I say to you, I'm a Christian, I think I'm now going to get a 50% stupidity discount, because I think you're now going to go, oh, okay. So now somehow what I say next has less credibility. If I say I'm a scientist, ooh. If I say I'm, whatever, ooh. But if I say I'm that, then I think that becomes really problematic. And I think there are a lot of people that are I'm certainly one of them, in the kind of deconstruction, that are thinking to themselves, actually, do you know what? I need to think about how I can socialize and how I can be honest about who I am. I've said before, one of the great benefits of getting old is you just don't care anymore, right? You just, it is what it is. But I think the idea of being able to, of having to camouflage or mask or conceal a key aspect of my social identity in the workplace is a problem. But I think that then I've got to say to myself, well, is the issue that one of the things that makes this so thorny, so problematic, is not necessarily the idea of theism, in other words, the idea of God, and your God may be a different God from my God, but I think the problem that we've got in the workplace is the idea of what I would call themism. And the idea is that there is them and those others. So if I'm a Muslim, I'm one of them, or if I'm a Jew, I'm one of those, or if I'm a Christian, I'm one of, and so forth. And I think this fundamental issue that I think inclusion is wanting desperately to wrap its arms around is to say, look, there is no separation. But the thing that liberates me in this conversation, why I want to have it in the workplace, is this notion of saying, actually, this profound respect for the union that we all have together. A complete respect for everyone's life and recognizing that we all share the same source of life.
But I think that requires a certain amount of common ground being created,
100%.
Which is safe enough to have these conversations in. Because I think that othering that you're describing, where and this is what I'm nervous about, I guess, is being othered. So you're like all those people who believe these political views and have these ideas, and I would want to say, no, I'm not like that, because I have different ideas, different views. But by then it almost feels like it's slipping away and it's becoming more difficult, because I've already been put into that category by saying something like I'm a Christian, whatever. And so I think the key here is actually opening up space to listen and to understand that we're actually talking to a human being who is specific in themselves, has their own life background, and they're not defined 100% by a kind of doctrine or a label. But at the same time, that's not to minimize at all that there are differences. So I think we're talking about a kind of dynamic conversation here where we can acknowledge difference, we can talk about maybe very strongly held views and be heard, and also listen to the other's point of view at the same time. Now, to me, this is a kind of very rich conversation that does incorporate and include people's different religious perspectives. And I think we can learn from that. I think we can grow from that. I think we can be enriched by it and nourished by it. I think what sometimes has happened, perhaps historically, is that especially under pressure, these views can get closed down, and you get that kind of sense of really there isn't a conversation anymore. It's just, this is the right way, this is the only way, and that's not a dialogue, that's a monologue.
Yeah, that's so true. And I do wonder if the real key, and thinking about your work as a therapist, I mean, and I'm not a therapist, but I mean, I know enough to know that, for example, if I was thinking about being a person-centered therapist, for example, what I'd be thinking to myself about the notion of self-regard, and then I'd be thinking about unconditional positive regard for the other. So if I can't hold you with unconditional positive regard, then things that you regard as being positive, I'm going to have a difficulty with, right? Because we get very dogmatic about that. And I feel like the thing that worries me so much about the way that we construct religious conversations, it feels like a bit of a zero-sum game. That feels to me a big mistake. It feels like the idea of, I want to be able to your point, listen and learn and be respectful and come to this conversation in a clean way, come to this conversation in non-judgment. Because actually the truth of the matter is, if I think about the what's happened in my spiritual walk, I've gone from a very narrow, very constricted, educated by Jesuits, raised by convent nuns. So by the time I was, old enough to be up to no good, I was so racked with guilt and anxiety and fear that I wouldn't, forget about it.
Which took all the fun out of it.
Well, I mean, to me, I was basically taught the idea that if it feels good, stop it, because it obviously must be sinning. And so actually to come out and then just go into a very muscular, evangelical world was even a whole nother conversation. But over the years, what I'm seeing happen is this kind of widening of the aperture, and this ability, this desire to be able to see God in all things. And I think that for me has been super liberating.
I think that's absolutely crucial to what I would say is spiritual growth, and how I've experienced spiritual change is, I think I started with a kind of model very much along the lines of what I was just describing, where this is the only way to think about things. For me, it happened to be an evangelical Christian worldview. And so the problem with that, and this is where it was helpful actually to be a therapist, because I started to kind of look at this from another angle, was like, actually, is this even healthy for me? To believe that if I do this, I'm in. If I deviate from this, I'm out. I'm in trouble. I'm going to be punished. Whatever, bad consequences. And I started to realize that my version of, in this case it was Christianity, but my religion was actually constraining me and shutting me down and not helping me to even hear myself. So where I ended up getting to was like, perhaps it's about opening up space where all of me can be heard by whatever we describe this as, God or higher power. But that whatever that spiritual experience is, it doesn't just get annexed into certain parts of my life that are acceptable and everything else gets screened out.
That's very nice. It's funny because I was thinking in the same way, having come through a sort of rigid frame and a very, to quote the scripture, narrow door, that coming through that path, I think one of the things that I was very conscious of was actually what's your therapy saved you, ironically. What saved me was being an inclusion practitioner, because when I started to think to myself about inclusion practice, and I started to think about the implications for whether or not you actually do honour diversity, whether or not you actually do honour difference, whether or not you celebrate and you make room and provide opportunities and access for difference, I began to think to myself, well now, hold on. Could it be possible that the 2010 Equality Act has a higher level of spiritual integrity than this Bible that I've been reading? Because if it does, that's a problem.
There's implications.
That's a serious problem.
Yeah.
Because in this piece of legislation, I was seeing there were protected characteristics that if I read my Bible correctly, if you were kind of ticking some of these boxes, it could be a tricky time for you when you die. So that really threw me into a bit of a spin. And I think what happened to me, which was my kind of liberation, the thing that pulled the plug or maybe turned on the light, I don't know which way I would say it to you, is that I realized that my great problem was this whole sola scriptura idea, the Bible only, was the real problem that was causing me, because it was my rule book. And so I had my sola scriptura, which was matching up against somebody else's Quran and somebody else's whatever else it might be. And I thought to myself, no, wait a minute, there's another way of thinking about this, that there is this universal source of life, and the universal source, the universal force of life has to be love. That has to be right. And if love is the universal source, then it doesn't seem to me that love excludes, love allows, right? Love doesn't possibly exclude. There's nothing to be excluded in love. And if something can't be excluded in love, then there's an entire part of my narrative that's going to have to get reauthored, and you know what part that might be, right? So I then thought to myself, oh, okay, well then maybe if I was able to, if I stop doing what I'm doing, which is I'm trying to understand God through the lens of the Bible, if I stop doing that and I start saying, let me understand the Bible through the lens of God, then I might have a different output. And I did, because once I thought God is love, I then was able to look into this, which my rule book, if you like, I was able to look at that and go, oh, hold on just a moment. If I'm now looking at God, the Bible through the lens of God, and God is love, I'm seeing something completely different. And so suddenly what happened was this great world, this monochrome world of religion became this technicolor world of spiritual possibility, where everybody was at the party. There was no one was excluded. Everybody was there, and there were no rules. There were no in. There were no out. There was no dogma. And suddenly, what that meant was, it meant I was just involved and inviting and embracing just very different conversations and learning from faith systems and people's perspectives that I never would have had access to because they were closed rooms in my mind, you know. And I think what I'd love to see is I'd love to see us be able to have that expression in the workplace. So I know we've done a lot of work around gender, for example, a lot of work around, I know it's still a particularly difficult one about ethnicity for reasons that we can talk about. But this notion of what people believe and people's sense about their eternal self and their spiritual self, that's such a core part of someone's identity, don't you think?
Yeah, I think it's also very connected to their well-being as well. So it's part of the identity, but that can be a helpful or not so helpful influence on identity. And what I found when I started to look at this through a therapeutic lens was what you're describing. I probably saw that from a more internal point of view, like how was I relating to myself? How were clients that I was seeing who were coming from a faith background, how are they relating to themselves? And 9 times out of 10, it was with a sense of judgment, a lot of self-criticism because of that feeling of not matching up to the rule book. And not matching up to the rule book means negative things about self-esteem, as opposed to this idea which I really embrace now, which is, if we're talking about spiritual practices, which is what the word religion in its root refers to, spiritual practice really, I think we're talking about ways of opening up to love.
I love that because I love that because I think the word religion is one of those damaged words, I think, because I think if the origin's interesting, isn't it? Because I think originally you're talking about spiritual practice, but I think there's also the element in which it means to bind back, and I think there's a sense in which it has that religiare word has taken that to bind you into something, and there's a rigidity to it. And it's interesting because when, in the turn of the 2000s, you'll know this. We started out. I kind of left my corporate world for some time. Well, I'd left it a little bit prior to that, but we set up a work called the Grace Project, and what we were interested in was working with damaged Christians, and it was extraordinary to see the people that would come to us, particularly from the arts and so on and so forth, that were just so hurt by religion and so conflicted and so confused, and they were being given this religious identity they were supposed to live into, this part they were supposed to be playing, and it was in such conflict with who they knew themselves to be. And you talk about the amount of, you do therapeutic counselling, the pastoral in counselling I was seeing, the lines were just as long as you can imagine, with people just coming, wanting to be free from this burden to be who they weren't. And I just thought to myself, that can't be right, can it? That cannot make sense. Yeah. And to find that freedom seems to me to be just so important.
And for me, the word freedom would link in with connection with oneself, connection with other people, and connection with the otherness, whatever that otherness is described as, whether it's God or a higher power or whatever, or just a sense of otherness actually is the word I think that really sums it for me. That is intrinsically healthy. I mean, for me as a therapist, I'd say being able to connect with oneself, with compassion, with love and acceptance, that will then springboard into being able to do the same with other people. So it completely goes into the inclusivity conversation. And I think that is fueled by a sense that there's something beyond, as they say in recovery programs, a higher power, so that it's not all down to me to solve every problem or to be a particular type of person that's going to be acceptable. I can lean back into this sense of spiritual presence.
How do I help in the workplace? How do I help my Muslim sister who's suffering from, Islamophobic aggressions because she wears a hijab? Or how do I support my Jewish colleague who needs to leave before dusk in the autumn because they're observing the Sabbath? Or how do I support my evangelical Christian friend who wants to have a Bible study in the office or whatever else it is? How do I make room for that? Because I think what I not fear, because that's not quite the right word, but what I'm concerned about is that I think we're sort of trying to lean into this from a diversity point of view, we're saying, well, let's create a little space for that group and a little space for that group. But I think it'd be really brave if we said, can we look at this again from an inclusion point of view? So we actually figured out how do we enable a fitting together version of our spiritual experiences, a fitting together of our religious experience. Because it feels to me there could be we could unlock something very powerful in there if we got hold of that.
I think we'd be unlocking a resource that otherwise might be blocked off because of this kind of scenario you're describing, that where people would retreat and withdraw. Yeah, I mean, at the physical level, yes, there's literally creating spaces where people can exercise their faith and their spiritual practices. But I think what we're really talking about is creating psychologically, and you could maybe even say spiritually safe environments where people can bring actually and share what it is that what their narrative is around religion in a way that's not going to be challenged, hyper questioned, but is going to have an empathic and listening response. So I think if there's any dialogue, it has to start with listening and understanding, because otherwise we go back to the other default, which is this person's like all of those people.
I agree. Do you know what? I love that, because what I find exciting about that is that organizations are confronted with a real issue right now, which is that our clients are facing into this, that nobody really wants to hear about your goods and your services, and certainly no one wants to buy your goods and services or sell your goods and services unless they know that you're in the business of service and good. Now, what's interesting is that you take any spiritual practice, and at its root is service and good, right? So the thing is, if we could esteem that, if we could elevate that, I could say, okay, if I really think that it's right that actually at the root of each of our faith systems is the universal source of life, which is love, then actually to liberate you to love and to liberate somebody else to love and to be of service and to do good in our communities would have such a transformative effect. Without the need, and I guess this is perhaps the point, without the need to think, oh, but you need to believe right and be like me, and to move past that. And I was just thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking just before a social justice program I used to be involved in, and there was this one glorious Christmas where we were dealing with food insecurity. There was this one glorious Christmas where we brought the whole community in, and we fed just about everybody. But what was stunning about it was in a Christian church. The food was provided by a Muslim food provider. All the toys were brought in by the Jewish community, and clothes and whatever else it was. And then we had Hindus and Sikhs and all sorts of stuff. And it just felt like, there's no other way I can say it to you. It just felt like in that moment of unity, where everybody had been elevated above the dogma and below their need to be rightism, and we're just doing what we were at core, just loving the community. It was just perfect. And I thought, just freeze frame that. Don't go back to your different little tribes. Just do this.
But that's people relating to people.
Towards a common need. There were these children that didn't have anything to eat. So I don't really care what you're reading or what you're praying on, or whether you have a mat or beads. These kids need to get fed.
You've got service and you've got people relating to people in service of a greater good. Right. And that's where the rubber hits the road and it lands, I think, for me. It's not just some kind of ethereal concept that we have in our private spaces. I think it lands in a public space as well.
Yeah, I agree.
Wherever that may be.
And I think, maybe, as I'm sure we've got to wind this conversation up, unfortunately, but I think maybe the real offer that I need to be able to make, if I'm going to be able to hold and host a conversation about religion in the workplace, is that I have to recognize and own the fact that the great thing about spirituality is I don't have to be right. That's the whole point of that. The whole point about it is that it's being uniquely who you are, right? That's what we're trying to do. Andre, this is a thread that I'd like to pull out more and more over years. I get to bring in guests that I want to talk about, particular things I want to chat about, and I'm glad you've come in and started this conversation. A final thought from you, though, as you're thinking about How would we deal with this religion in the workplace?
The word that keeps coming to my mind is hospitality and hosting.
Lovely.
And I think it is about hosting spaces where people can be themselves with all aspects of who they are, being able to express that and be heard and be understood for who they are, rather than being just kind of almost lumped in with a wider block of people who believe that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Andre, thank you for being with us. I appreciate it. And well, that's our inclusion podcast. I hope we've primed a bit of a conversation with you. Please, please, please reach out and talk to us particularly if you want to explore this idea more. We're super interested in holding space around these conversations, and please recognise that I think for us this is a conversation where we really do want to come in peace, but it's a conversation I think we really need to have. So thank you for viewing today, and see you soon. Bye bye for now.